Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. We have a number of topics to discuss tonight, including Iraq, Syria, Iran, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the immigration issue we're going to try to get into, as well as Monsanto. So we're going to have to go through some of this stuff faster than we would like. Now, a couple things we need to get out of the way. I need to request and ask that if you are interested in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whatever side or perspective you may have on the issue where you come from, then go back and listen to the interview that I conducted last week with Dr. Gabriel Batarse. And Dr. Batarse is an 82-year-old Palestinian man who lived in Palestine before the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and he has a lot of interesting things to say. I'll mention more about that interview in a second, but before I do, I want to encourage you all to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night here at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. Again, Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can get the show's personal page at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks, and there you will access the RSS feed, links to my more recent articles and posts at brandonturbeville.com on the left-hand side of the page. And you'll also get the archive versions of this show on the left-hand side of the page, and of course the chat room there at the bottom right-hand corner. You can follow my work as it comes out at activistpost.com and theantimedia.org, two of the sites that I write for regularly. And you can catch, if you're just interested in my work specifically, then go to brandonturbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of my interviews, all of the YouTube videos, the archive versions of this show, and all the other relevant information. Of course, you can get my books there as well. The latest book is The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria, which explains the Syrian situation that continues to rage in Syria right now, but it'll also help explain what's happening in Iraq and some of the geopolitical issues that are taking place in the Middle East and across the world, including Ukraine. So we're going to try to get into some of that a little later. Now, first order of business, I want to point out that here in Florence, South Carolina, we have a few people who are interested in speaking up and standing up for the right thing, right, the truth and so forth as they see it. And what they're doing is they're putting on a weekly set of viewings of documentaries and health talks and so forth. And this is at Health First in Florence, South Carolina. Health First is a chiropractic office. We've got a couple good doctors there, and they do excellent work. They don't just do chiropractic. They have massage therapy and a few other things as well. And members of this audience, if you are looking for a healthcare practitioner and you're in the Florence area, the South Carolina, North Carolina region, you're able to travel, then I would recommend Health First to you, hands down, as the best chiropractic practice here in Florence. And of course, in addition to their excellent chiropractic services and massage therapy services and so forth, they have a number of natural supplements that they sell, as well as the information that they have there as well. I mean, you can go in and you can pick up a few flyers about chemtrails and read the material about the dangers of vaccination. Maybe pick up a DVD of some information that's there as well. And again, every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Health First in Florence, South Carolina. And I could get that. I wish I had the address for you if you had a GPS, but I don't. So you could just type in Health First. That's health and 1ST, Florence, South Carolina, and that'll give you the address. It's on Palmetto Street in Florence, South Carolina, every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. And even if you are interested, if you're interested in the films and so forth that they're going to show, you should turn up. But if you're already aware and privy to the information, then I would encourage you to turn up anyway, so you could meet some like-minded people and be a part of this network that they're trying to build of people who are engaged and actually want to stand up for the right thing and change this world for the better while we still have the opportunity to do that. So please go check them out and support them however you can. Now, again, I began the show by talking about an interview that I conducted last week here on this show with Dr. Gabriel Batarse, and the sound was not as good as I had hoped, but we went through all kinds of tribulations to get that interview. We tried to record over the phone, we tried to record over Skype, we tried everything we knew to do, and nothing would work right for that interview. But we eventually got it recorded, and again, the sound is not what we'd hoped, but you can still hear it, and I'd encourage you. You might have to listen a little hard to pick up on what he's saying, especially at first. But if you listen harder, you'll benefit from the information, right? Because this is a person who's not somebody who sat around and read this information in a book. This is a person who lived it. This is living history. So, you have any question about what happened in Israel in 1948, then you can ask this man, because he lived there before the Israelis came in and began their racist settler state. And supported by the British and the United States and of course the Soviet Union, and he explains all of that. He explains his life in Palestine before the Israelis had their settler state legitimized by the United States and the Soviet Union and so forth. And what's interesting is that I'm always perplexed. Perplexed is not the right term, right? I'm not ignorant as to why people believe the things they do, but sometimes you hear these things and you wonder to yourself, how on earth can somebody actually walk around with these ideas? But we have a lot of people who believe that the narrative that poor Israel, poor innocent Israel, God's chosen people, are surrounded by horrible Muslim extremists who want to slaughter them and put them in concentration camps like Hitler. And that before 1948, it was the same situation, that all the Jews were being persecuted, and it was a Jewish homeland that the Jews had a right to return because they had been kicked off by some mythical force that removed them from the land, and they were just simply coming back, and the poor Israelis are just surrounded by enemies, and that and this is the narrative. And that when they came back to the Jewish homeland, of course, there was nothing there. There were no buildings, there were no people. There was just all this land just waiting on them. They never had to lift a finger, right? Well, of course, all of that is BS. That couldn't be further from the truth. It's very rarely mentioned that these Zionist settlers, these Jews in name only, I guess we should call them Ginos, maybe. The Zionists came over when the British still had control of Palestine and colonial control of Palestine. Of course, this was encouraged from a number of European activist organizations that were sponsored by big governments and big corporations and Rothschild and so forth as well, to send Jews. Again, the Jews in name only, the Zionists of I guess Khazar bloodline, over to Israel to colonize it and set up a settler state. So make no mistake that these European governments and Britain were heavily involved in the creation of Israel. And of course, when the Israelis, the Zionists, get there, they form the Communist Party, because they were closely connected to the communists in Soviet Russia. They were, in fact, many of them were Russian Zionists who came over to Israel, Eastern European and Russian, as well as several other countries, but Eastern European and Russian mainly. And they came over and they took land from people who owned it. These were people who had nice houses, they had businesses, they had schools, it was modern, it was much better than 2014 Detroit. I would rather live in 1948 Palestine any day of the week, or at least in the modernized sections. And it was a government where Jews and Christians and Muslims all lived together. There was a 30% Christian population, which is only 3% now, because the lovely Israelis have ran the Christians out, despite the fact that these idiotic Zio-Christians, the Zionist Christians over here, who continually part ways with their money to send more Zionists over to Israel to exterminate the Palestinians, doing exactly the same thing that Hitler did to the Jews, minus a few aesthetic details. And of course the Christians never get it, because some book told them that certain peoples were better than others, and they just they just buy it hook, line, and sinker. And of course, that wasn't even fully preached in the churches until maybe 100 or so years ago, maybe more than 100 years ago now. But the late 1800s is when all this stuff really became preached in the Christian churches here in the West as some type of doctrine. But of course, they believe it, how easily they believe it. So if you listen to Dr. Batarseh's interview, I actually asked him to speak to the Zionist Christians, the supporters of Israel, and it's a very powerful response that he gives when you find out that how many of these Christians have been driven out of Palestine and have had their land stolen from them, and yet all of this has been supported by Western Christians. They're some of the worst, actually, in terms of talking about Zionism and the creation of Israel. But, so I guess this is a perfect segue into the Israel-Hamas situation, right? We have to look at this. The justification, of course, is the 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped and killed. And it's blamed, of course, on Hamas. It's blamed on Hamas, but here are some interesting things. Was it even Hamas that was involved in the kidnapping of the Israeli teenagers? I mean, one of us even somebody has to ask the question, did this even happen? I mean, remember the motto of Mossad is by way of deception. So they're certainly not above this. I mean, they're scum. Look at what they've done to the Palestinians ever since 1948. You think they wouldn't kill 3 teenagers and then use that as a pretext for some type of invasion? Of course they would. But aside, let's just say that this happened, that 3 teenagers were kidnapped and killed. And I'm not saying that it didn't. I'm just saying that this is the case, that this is the possibility. There are suggestions that it was actually not Hamas itself, but yet another group which had links to ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, or Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. ISIS, the successor to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? So it's possible that these groups had links to ISIS that kidnapped these teenagers. But it's blamed on Hamas, and I want to get more into Hamas in a second, because Hamas, for those of us who oppose the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians, it's important not to see Hamas as this sort of angelic representation of resistance, because they're not. And I'll get into that in a second. Hamas is not what you might think it is. So, if this is the case, the extremists who killed these teenagers, who happened to be hiking at night in, I think, the in Gaza, I believe. Why? This is foolish anyway. But the perpetrators were linked to ISIS, and of course we know that Israel has supported ISIS. Israel actually has set up hospitals in Israel for the Syrian death squads, the fanatics, the extremists, the mental deficients, the cannibals who have gone over to Syria to fight the government of Assad have been brought back to Israel when they get wounded. And you can actually see Benny Netanyahu shaking the hands of a death squad fighter in an Israeli hospital. So there should be no doubt as to the fact that the Israelis support the death squads in Syria. So if these groups are connected to ISIS, then there is a tangential connection to Israel. In fact, there's more. It's not just indirect connections to Israel. This is actually a direct connection to Israel, the intelligence agencies, I should say. But we have the massive arrest of Hamas fighters, Hamas activists, Hamas directors, and so forth, and a lot of people who were completely innocent, just Palestinians, guilty of being Palestinians, who were just arrested in this massive sweep and taken to jail. Hamas responded with a rocket or two. Of course, it's being the rockets, as far as I know, none of the rockets have actually made it into Israel because of this Iron Dome system, which appears to be working pretty well, and it should, for God's sake. The United States has paid for it. The U.S. taxpayer, you listening to this radio show, if you're in the United States, you paid for the Iron Dome, and it's working. See, this is a perfect example of what government spending can be used to do. You can actually create productive things that actually produce and provide a legitimate service. Unfortunately, our government takes those and ships them over to Israel to exterminate innocent people. That's another topic, but the government issue is another topic. But this situation, we have Hamas firing missiles into Israel. Nobody that I know of has been. None of these missiles, as far as I know, have actually connected because of the Iron Dome. But I could be mistaken about that. I'll have to check up on it. But the Israelis are responding with missiles, with artillery, with airstrikes at residential homes, and they're giving warnings to the Palestinians that bombings are going to come in by sending smaller bombs into the neighborhoods. Right? This is the Israeli Public Relations Office at work, and as you can see, it's pretty bad. It's the only ineffective office that Israel has, is the Public Relations Office, but they don't need it because it doesn't matter, because they're Israelis and they could do anything, literally anything, and the idiot Christians in the West will support them because they read it in a book and it was told to them by some guy in a nice suit who drives a nice car and wears a nice watch, tells them that some people are more equal than others in such utopias. So, now we've got to talk about Hamas. We've got to talk about what Hamas is. Now, Hamas is not an angelic force in the Middle East. Hamas, you have to go back and see how Hamas was created. I mentioned earlier the interview with Dr. Badarseh and the statistics that there was 30% Christian population in Palestine before 1948, and now we're down to 3. And the reason that is because the Israelis who ran out the Christians, they ran out Christians. In fact, you can see on the internet, you can see some of the pictures where the Israelis have knocked down Christian churches and spray painted Jesus is a monkey and so forth on the churches. They have no respect for Christians, none at all. In fact, they don't even have any respect for the Jews who live there, the real Jews, the ones that believe in the religion and who practice the religion and who were in Palestine before the Khazars, the Zionists, came in. They have no respect for those people. They're treated like second-class citizens. But you're never told that by John Hagee or Glenn Beck or any of these lunatic commentators out there. You're never told that by your preacher or by your mainstream media. Of course you wouldn't be. So anyway, we've got to go back. The Christian population, essentially, many of them were very well-educated people and had friends in Europe and across the rest of the world, in Australia and stuff like that, and many of them fled. They just left. They had to get out of there. They didn't want to live in a gutter, in a ghetto, so they left. What was left were the Muslim populations, and they weren't left with much. They had no real coordinated military. And out of that, we have the growth of things like the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Fatah. These were, Arafat and his groups who were trying to not only get a political solution, but also, out of necessity, having to fight military battles. But what happens is Hamas, which is a fundamentalist organization, a Muslim fundamentalist organization. Now, they're not the cannibals of Syria, but they're not good guys. They are fundamentalist Muslims, right? These are people who support the Syrian death squads, and we'll get into that in a minute. Again, be clear. I need to be clear and say that that Hamas is not the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. They are not ISIS, but they aren't. They're certainly not secular, right? These are, again, Muslim fundamentalists. They exist in a vacuum. They exist in the vacuum of a stabilizing force, of a unified resistance against Israel. And don't forget that Israel does indeed have intelligence agencies and apparati in operation with Hamas. That they have some controlling factor over Hamas. They've infiltrated Hamas, and so they can use them to stir up situations whenever necessary. It doesn't mean the whole thing is controlled by Israeli intelligence, but it is significantly affected by it. It has been infiltrated, so there's that to be considered as well. But again, Hamas exists in a vacuum. All that they have left is Hamas. They've got nothing else. And again, Hamas broke away from Fatah, which is largely in the West Bank. It's the sort of official, Fatah is the official ruling group of Palestine. And of course they have the Palestinian parliament. It seems they are trying to come together now and form a coalition government. But over the last 2 years or so, Hamas broke away. And this is, of course, I would look at Israeli intelligence, because what they want to do is to break any unification of the Palestinian front. And of course they want to use Hamas as the poster boy for the Palestinian resistance because of their fundamentalism. It's good PR to see Hamas there. So we can't look at Hamas as this angelic force in the Middle East. But essentially, it's the only thing that many of these Palestinians have left. In other words, Hamas is the best of a bad situation, and that's it. So that's what we've got there. The disgusting reaction in the pro-Israeli Zionist Western press, the gloating over dead Palestinians, and mainly this is coming not so much from the left, who used to be overwhelming with their attacks of anti-Semitism and so forth. If anybody criticized the settler state of Israel, of ISIS Ra-El, then now we see a lot of these reactions coming from the Zionist Christians, and these are some of the most disgusting and vile statements that you can find on the internet. These Zionist Christian idiots. And fool and his money soon go separate ways. And we see a lot of Christians in the West, and particularly the United States, showing their intellectual credibility right now with their support of Israel and the Zionist organizations that push them. So that's all we've got to say about that. Well, I guess we should talk about a solution. We hear many solutions about the 1967 borders. And, this would be certainly preferable to the 2014 borders. But I'm sorry, this is a cop-out. I'm sorry, Israel does not have a right to exist. Why don't we go back to the 1947 borders, when it was one country, when it was Palestine? Now that's going to prove some complications, because you have Israelis who have legitimately lived in I say legitimately, but they have lived in these buildings and these houses and these towns for their entire life, and they are, unfortunately, this had to happen, but every much as a Palestinian as the Palestinians. So we'd have to craft a system where I don't think at this point that a right of return is the way to go, simply because it's just too much. Now, of course, many of these settlers are going to have to get the hell out. These Israeli settlers, I would say anybody who was not born in Israel can just get the hell out. That would be part of the plan, the peace plan. But the Palestinians, for those who could not return, should be given ample compensation, and I mean ample compensation. And of course, they should have the right of return to Palestine. And when I say they shouldn't have the right of return, I don't mean they shouldn't be able to come back to the country. I mean they might not be able to resume the ownership of the property that their grandfather owned that was taken away from them by the Zionists. We would have to provide them with compensation and so forth. There's a way to do this. And of course, the best way to enforce such a thing is to stop funding the damn Israelis. And we should immediately cut funding for these genocidal, racist maniacs. And of course, the other way to reach a peace plan is to work together with existing governments like Russia, with Putin, for instance. There's a vested interest across the world to see this conflict end. And of course, if you could get two major powers, the United States and Russia, for instance, then the decrepit European Union would have not, certainly not as much to say. Then they could go ahead and spin themselves into irrelevance where they are at this point, largely irrelevance. They're not militarily capable and not likely to do anything if the United States and Russia join together to enforce this peace plan. The cooperation between Russia and the United States would be necessary, but this is the idea of a peace plan for me. Not the 1967 borders, that's not fair. Not the 1948 borders, that's not fair. The 1947 borders, one country, one state solution, right of return for some people, expulsion for some people, ample compensation for the Palestinians who return and who were kicked off of their land. So this is the structure of a peace plan in my book. So we're coming up on the end of the segment, and I just spent the entire half of the show discussing Israel and Hamas, and I think before we go back into the international realm, the geopolitical realm, we need to talk about Monsanto, and we need to talk about the immigration crisis. These are two of the things that are very important, but maybe we'll talk about immigration when we come back and then get into Monsanto. We'll see. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We've got a lot to talk about yet. Still need to get into the geopolitics. Remember to go back from last week and listen to my interview with Dr. Gabriel Batarse. It's up at BrandonTurbeville.com, the YouTube video and the audio file. And also remember the Florence, South Carolina Health First meetings, the viewings of the documentaries and the discussions of GMO food and fluoride, vaccines, chemtrails, and that sort of thing. Again, Health First in Florence, South Carolina on Palmetto Street. Maybe next week we can give you the direct address, but hopefully you can Google that. So, again, Monday night and Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, UCY.TV, Truth on the Tracks. We've got another segment coming up where we're going to get into Monsanto and immigration. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
Israeli tanks and military vehicles have been moving toward the Gaza border as Israel expands its ground offensive into the Palestinian territory. As Israeli military operations intensified on Sunday, at least 40 Palestinians were killed by Israeli shelling. Militants in Gaza responded with rocket fire into the Jewish state. Gaza residents said land and naval shelling were the heaviest in 13 days of fighting, the worst to take place between Israel and Hamas in 2 years. According to a military statement, Israel has sent additional forces into Gaza in an attempt to destroy a network of tunnels out of the Palestinian territory, as well as searching for potential weapons stockpiles. A diplomatic solution to stem the tide of violence looks unlikely.
This 19-year-old is living in the shadows in Southern California. He's an illegal immigrant who says he's running away from unimaginable gang violence in his home country, Guatemala. But he is not just a victim. He admits he is also a perpetrator, recruited by the gangs when he was just 9. They were like my second family, he says. A second family that soon wanted him to run guns, drugs, and eventually kill in Guatemala. I decapitated people. There was killing without mercy, he says. Now a father, he breaks down in tears, telling the story of the things he saw and did before his many attempts to cross into the U.S. illegally as a child.
Do you think the reason why so many children are coming to the U.S., especially now, is because they're so afraid of the gangs there?
Sí, muchos.
Yes, the gangs forced them to join. This is the new norm, to become a gangster, he says. He and gang experts tell us the most powerful gangs now in Central America originated from here in this Los Angeles neighborhood. More than a decade ago, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement began major crackdowns on transnational gang activity. According to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, between 2001 and 2012, more than 185,000 convicted immigrants were sent back to Central America. Those numbers include members of L.A.'s notoriously violent Mara Salvatrucha gangs, known as MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang. Some of those deported gangbangers eventually became kingpins in Central America, terrorizing the population.
The gang members over there look up to anything that comes from LA. So you might be a small guy, but you come from LA, so that makes you a leader.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Again, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at UCY.tv. Now, the previous segment, the first half, we discussed the Israeli-Palestinian issue and some solutions and some history, as well as discussed Hamas. Now, we need to turn to the domestic front briefly to talk about immigration. Now, by the time you hear this show, and I should mention that the show is being recorded on July 16th. I pre-record about a week in advance, so some of this information that you're going to get is a week old, but still way ahead of the mainstream media. I'm sure you know that by now. But we're discussing immigration. We've had such a divisive discussion of this. And of course the conservatives, because there's the Democrat in office, oppose immigration. Now they supported it under Bush because it drove down wages and helped major industries. They oppose it now because a Democrat's in office. The left-wingers, of course, support anything that that seems to remind them of 1963 and the civil rights movement. Of course, the white liberals on full civil rights watch. You know, they joyous for anything that spells the death of white America, and of course the radicalized minorities who blame everything on racism on the left, and of course the conservatives, of course, they, because the Democrats in office, oppose immigration for their own reasons, right? They want a nation of laws when there's a Democrat. They want a nation for the business, the big corporations and so forth when there's a Republican. But we actually have to somewhat side with the people on the right. Now, we're not going to go as far as the stupid border fence, which is designed to keep you in and not keep them out. And it's also a stupid way to watch a border. We're not in favor of the border fence, of course, but we have to look at this immigration issue for what it is. Right? There's a number of reasons. We got to look at the reasons that this immigration is taking place. The first reason, of course, is to drive down wages. And big corporations love this, by the way, because people come over, they're not fully citizens, they don't fully have the protections that the American citizen would have, so they come over, they could be used as slave labor, or at least given slave labor wages, so they could send back home to their country with their inflated currencies and so forth, with the American dollar. So the big corporations love this because they could treat these people like garbage and make tons of profit. And they're very hardworking, generally speaking. Now, the second reason is simply to destroy the culture. Now, I don't really give a damn if this is considered racist by the left-wingers or not, because virtually everything is. And if you play this political correct game and the white guilt game, you will never, ever win, because there's never enough collective guilt to go around. But we look at Europe and see what's happened in Europe. They've just opened the floodgates to immigration. They've advertised. Britain, for instance, is one of the best places to go if you're an immigrant to get on a welfare program. And what it is, it's designed to destroy the culture of Western societies. They bring in cultures which are vastly different. Now, granted, Latin America and the United States are not so vastly different because there is the Christian religion, there is the American Southwest, which is very, very similar to Mexico, for instance, and some of South America. So it's not so different as they have had in Europe, which is cultures which are predominantly Protestant or or Catholic, but predominantly Christian and predominantly white. And they bring in cultures that are predominantly, Middle Eastern or predominantly black in Africa, with predominantly Muslim religion. And they bring these guys in to the European countries. They put them up on some welfare programs, and they stick them in ghettos. And of course, they don't try to assimilate to the European culture. I mean, they don't really have the opportunity to. They live in ghettos around their own, I guess the proper term, I mean, it's not the proper term, but their own kind, their own people. And they don't learn the language, they don't learn the customs and so forth. It's all designed that way. And of course, they bring wages down. They cause massive unemployment against the actual citizens, for the actual citizens of these countries. And it destroys culture. You have people who grow up, the people in Britain are now saying, I don't even know what it's like, what it means to be British anymore. Because they brought people in from all over the world and they've dumped them there who've kept their customs. And I'm sorry, these countries are not melting pots. They are they're European. And they have European culture, and they have their own cultures, which are just as important as anybody else's culture. Don't let the white liberals tell you any different. But they're being destroyed. In fact, Tony Blair actually admitted that it was his job. He saw it as his job to alter the culture of Britain forever. And boy, did he do it with the immigration. And he was referring to immigration specifically. So there's no doubt that this is one of the reasons that this is allowed in. All right, there's a third reason, too. There's the possibility, and I've talked about this 2 weeks ago, and I've talked about it on several interviews that I've done, the possibility that we're being geared up for a massive terror attack inside the United States to be blamed on ISIS in coordination with domestic extremists. And it's likely that the narrative that's going to be given to us is that ISIS, the fighters, came up from Mexico. Now, in reality, what it's going to be is that the ISIS fighters fly back in coach from Syria, from Iraq, paid for by the U.S. State Department or the CIA or the British intelligence or NATO, and they fly back in coach, and they get off of the plane, and they go to meet their FBI handler or so forth, and they're given bombs to go nuke American cities. And domestic extremists will be blamed and say that they worked in coordination with them and showed them how to make bombs and so forth. But the narrative will be that they walked across the Mexican border, and it's believable enough. I mean, hell, all you got to do is go to Guatemala, and you can just walk right through. Maybe the government will pay to bus you to the cities that you're going to bomb. But it's likely that we are being geared up to see a massive terror attack in the United States of the nuclear variety, possibly nuking major cities here in the United States. Washington, D.C., New York, Charleston, Chicago. These are some of the cities that I've heard repeated. We had Dick Cheney, Lindsey Graham, Obama have mentioned this before. We've got retired generals hinting around at it and so forth. And of course the mainstream media has been repeating it incessantly. So we got to be prepared for that. And I want to mention that toward the end of the show if I can get to it. But the immigration issue, the question is, first, the question of children, right? That all of these people are refugees. First of all, they've been immigrants. There's 40 million illegal aliens. Not undocumented persons. These are illegal aliens. These are people who are illegally in the United States. It's against the law. Sorry, I don't care. I don't really care how that sits with anybody. They're illegal by the virtue of their being here. Now, the idea that they're refugees from some type of violence in Guatemala, I want to see the violence. Now, these are not perfect places, but where's the violence? Where did all this spring up? Is there a color revolution down there? Is there a civil war down there? We haven't been told any of this stuff. But suddenly there's a human rights emergency. Now, second of all, the idea that what do you do with the children who are coming across the border alone? Well, I want to ask the first question, first of all, what kind of parent would send their child from Guatemala all the way up from that horrible country of Mexico with its drug gangs and its civil war and its lawlessness to go to the United States. What kind of parent would do that? And not all of the people who are coming over are children, by the way. A lot of them are adults. They're families, and they're adults. They're also gang members. Let's not forget about that. They are bringing crime. So do you turn these people away? You're damn right you turn them away. They're not American citizens. You want to come to the United States, you apply, and you do it legally. Otherwise, you can take your ass back to your home country. That is the way it's got to be handled. Now, if they come over the border and they're hungry, you feed them. If they're thirsty, you give them water. If they are tired, you give them rest. But you ship them back home, because this is not their home. Now, we see the left-wingers. We see, well, first of all, I should comment on the right-wingers, because this is going to tie in. The right-wingers who want to send silly militias down, who are, many of these people who are involved in this border protest, they have militias and so forth down there. Many of them are very questionable people who are involved in the Cloven Bundy crap that I talked about here on this show. That's set up. So they were involved in that. And now they're down there on the border, and people are falling for it all over again. So you got the right-wingers down there, on the conservatives and so forth, people who consider themselves conservatives, down on the border, who are attacking the immigrants. Well, it's not the immigrants' fault. They're just trying to find a better life for themselves. See, this is how it works. They create a controversy and they turn you in on each other. You're in the same boat with the immigrants, you lunatics. You attack these people, you're attacking yourself. They are not the enemy. The enemy are the people who let them through. So focus on the enemy. Don't focus on Hispanics or immigrants or blacks or Jews or whites. It's ridiculous. You're all in the same boat, whether you know it or not. But then you have the left-wingers who claim that all of this is racist. It's so racist. I mean, does this even need to be addressed, the race issue? White liberals will call a ham sandwich racist if they don't like the way it tastes. So that should be dismissed out of hand. What's their solution? Open borders, total open borders. Because that makes us feel all warm and cuddly inside, right? If we open up borders to everybody that wants to come through. No thought to how you're going to pay for all that. No thought to what happens to wages. No thought to what happens to crime and assimilation, because all that should be thrown out of the window. And assimilation's bad, right? That's racism. Maybe the patriarchy did that or something. But what about the anarchists? What are the anarchists saying? This is what have I been saying here on this show for so long? Anarchy is absolute uselessness. What am I hearing from the anarchists now about the immigration system? Well, we should let them in. Those people should be brought in because I don't believe in borders. Well, there's a funny thing about borders, guys. You don't need to believe in them in order for them to exist. And they do exist. Now, whether or not you believe in borders because you have this really crazy idea of some type of world utopia, that's beside the point. If you don't believe in borders, then I'm going to suggest to you right now to give up your First Amendment and your Second Amendment and all the other amendments that you have, because constitutions are based on borders. And I know many anarchists will respond that, well, I don't believe in documents that give us rights and so forth. Well, you know, you might not believe in it, but you can give those rights up. If you don't believe in the document stating that you have those rights, then you can give them up because they're going to go away very soon if you assume that ideology. So the anarchists want total open borders because they don't believe in borders. Now they want their rights that those borders provide them, or allegedly are supposed to provide them. I'll give that as a caveat. I'll take that point fair enough, but they want the rights that they're allegedly supposed to have under those borders. They just don't want the borders. This is typical anarchist useless logic. But let's go back to the race baiting, because the anarchists are falling for this too. They're saying that these people belong here because this land once belonged to them. In other words, they're Native Americans. They're not. They're Guatemalans. They're Mexicans. They're South Americans. They're not Native Americans. Again, I go back to the border issue. You don't have to believe in it in order for it to exist. And if you want to play that card, I see these memes floating around, or these videos where Native Americans are telling these white protesters and stuff, they're telling them, well, you were the immigrant. You were the immigrant here at one point. Yeah, exactly. That's my damn point. White Europeans came over here as immigrants, and what happened to the Native Americans? That's not an example of why we should open up borders. That's an example of why we should close them. You don't want to turn into what happened to the Native Americans, do you? But as for the idea that these people are Americans, they simply are not. And if you want to follow that logic down as far as it'll go, well then you should probably go tell the Mexicans to give their land back to the Indians, the native peoples of what was Mexico. Because let's not forget that what is a Mexican is a Spaniard, a European, a white European who bred in with the Indian peoples after they conquered the land. So I guess you better go tell those Mexicans to give up their land. That only works if they're white people, right? They have to give up land and so forth. It's crazy logic. And once again, the anarchists are working on the side of the government and of Wall Street. Have you ever seen an anarchist that didn't fight for Wall Street? I'm looking for one. I hate to beat up on anarchists because I know so many of them, are mean well, and so many of them are actually personal friends, and we are, I consider them brothers in arms. But guys, you got to get street smart at some point. And this anarchy stuff, this is nothing more than a 5-year-old throwing a fit. You're going to have to grow up and get streetwise and do something productive. Because you're only dragging yourself down with this anarchy stuff, and you're dragging everybody else down, and that's so much worse. So you have to straighten up with that. Now, I need to get into the Monsanto situation before we go, before the end of the show. And I've got an article up on Activist Post and BrandonTurbeville.com entitled, "Is Monsanto Contributing to the Rise in Mass Shootings?" Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to sum this up, because what this is revolving around is the CYP450 enzymes. Now, many of you might remember that I had an article back in 2013 where I discussed the CYP450 enzymes and their relations to drug metabolism. For instance, CYP450 enzymes, basically, they're everybody has them. It stands for cytochrome P450 enzymes. And essentially what they do is that they are responsible for most of the metabolism of pharmaceutical drugs, psychopharmaceutical drugs, and so forth. They're responsible for metabolizing that in the body. And of these enzymes, there are the CYP2C9, CYP2C19, CYP2D6, etc. All of these are part of that family. And again, for instance, CYP2D6 enzymes are responsible for most, like 20 to 30% of drug metabolism in that enzyme family. CYP450 is responsible for at least half of drug metabolism. Right. So this is pharmaceutical drug metabolism is what they're related to. And this is not something that is, sort of pie in the sky or some natural health website is promoting this. I mean, you can go to the Mayo Clinic and see that these enzymes are responsible for drug metabolism. And of these enzymes, we have different classifications. For instance, we have extensive metabolizers, poor metabolizers, intermediate metabolizers, and ultra-rapid metabolizers. Now, extensive metabolizers are considered the normal genotype. This is free of the aberrant behavior, I guess you should say, that the other enzymes have. The poor metabolizers have deficient enzyme function. We have the intermediate metabolizers who have some functioning enzymes but also have some non-functioning enzymes. And we have the ultra-rapid metabolizers, which have obviously ultra-rapid enzymes. Now, basically what this means is if you have an extensive metabolizing enzyme, that if you take an OxyContin, you're going to be able to process it as a normal person would process OxyContin. You're going to take it in your body, it's going to activate, you're going to feel its effects, it's going to wear off, and you're going to pass it through your system. Now, if you have a poor metabolizer, you take one OxyContin and you could die because your body is not properly metabolizing this medication. And you could experience the side effects of the medication, or you could simply overdose. If you have an intermediate metabolizer, the chances of those negative effects are smaller, but they're still present. If you have an ultra-rapid metabolizer, typically you could take an OxyContin and feel nothing. For instance, I'm not saying that, I'm just using the OxyContin as an example. So it's pretty clear that these enzymes play the roles in which I've just said. You can look at the Mayo Clinic, and I've got numerous studies that prove this that are attached to the article and linked to the article. So if you have poorly functioning CYP450 enzymes, then you're much more likely to experience negative effects of those enzymes, of those drugs. I apologize. So here's the interesting thing. People are given psychopharmaceutical drugs constantly, but they're not given a test to see whether or not these enzymes are indeed working properly. And there is a genetic test that can be done. It's fairly inexpensive, that will tell you whether or not these drugs or that these enzymes work properly. But people are being prescribed psychopharmaceuticals and not being tested, so they don't know whether or not they're at greater risk for the side effects and so forth. So that raises the question of whether or not a lot of these people are, a lot of these psychiatrists and so forth, are guilty of failure to warn, because nobody's being told that they have such a propensity to negative effects, to side effects to this stuff. Now, I personally went out and interviewed a number of people who are in the psychiatric and psychological industry, and I asked them about CYP450 enzymes, and because at the time of the writing of my article I didn't know that they existed, I actually assumed that most of them wouldn't know, in my arrogance, I guess. But it turns out that most of them knew. They knew that if these enzymes didn't function properly, then there was the extreme likelihood that there was adverse side effects. So they knew this. I was a little surprised about that. But here's the kicker, right? Think about glyphosate. Now, for those of you who don't know what glyphosate is, it's a pesticide, but it's Roundup, essentially. It's owned by Monsanto. It's Roundup. Glyphosate is Roundup. It's the most widely used herbicide in the United States. So I'm sorry, I said pesticide, but it's an herbicide. Now, we know it's an environmental toxin. We know it's toxic to humans and mammals in general, but one of the properties of glyphosate is the fact that it inhibits the CYP450 enzyme from working properly. Now, again, that's well known. We've got numerous studies. This is a well-documented scientific fact that glyphosate reduces and inhibits the proper functioning of CYP450 enzymes. Now, with that being said, you've got like 80% of soy is genetically modified, right? We have, I think, 90% of corn. It's 90% of soybeans, 70% of corn and cotton are Roundup-ready crops, right? Which means that they are resistant to Roundup, which is glyphosate, which also means that not only is glyphosate used on these products, but they're used a lot, and especially when these Roundup-resistant weeds pop up around it, they're used even more. So you're talking about 90% of soybeans, 70% of corn in the United States have glyphosate on them. This is our diet. Soybeans and corn and everything. You're talking about a population which is being doused with a chemical that inhibits their CYP450 enzymes. So whenever they take a psychopharmaceutical medication, they are at greater risks for side effects. In fact, when you look at the levels at which glyphosate causes cytochrome P450 enzymes to be reduced or inhibited, it's 100 times lower than the recommended use in agricultural products. So we're talking about a relatively small amount of glyphosate that causes this inhibition. So you wonder, a lot of these mass shootings and these bizarre and strange acts of violence, are they related? Are they related to the CYP450 enzyme? Are they related to psychopharmaceuticals? Are they related to Monsanto and Roundup? So all this stuff play in together with one another. It's a good question. So please go check that article out. It's up at Activist Post. I've got to mention here, we've had on the geopolitical segment again, we need to go back and mention that Assad has been sworn in for the third 7-year term in Syria. So that's the formality of Assad's presidency. We've also got announcements by the Pentagon that they are planning a training program for the Syria opposition. And remember, there are no moderates in Syria. So who are they going to train? They're going to train ISIS. They're going to train the Nusra Front. They're going to train the cannibals. So bear that in mind as well. We got this ridiculous article by Holly Yan in CNN, or at least it's ridiculously titled, "How did this happen? Iraq, Syria, Gaza, and Libya all in flames?" How did this happen? This is the quality of mainstream media, right? This is CNN. How did this happen in Iraq and Syria and Gaza and Libya? They're all in flames and we just don't have a clue. It must be the Arab Spring, right? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. Well, for one thing, we invaded Iraq in 1991, and then we imposed horrible sanctions on them, and then we invaded in 2003, and then we pulled out. We funded ISIS to go in and take over well over half of the country. You want to know what happened in Syria? We funded a rebellion in Syria where we paid death squads. We trained armed death squads and funneled them through Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia paid for them. We trained them in Jordan. We trained them in Turkey. We used them, those two places, as logistical staging grounds to stage an armed rebellion against the Assad government. What happened in Libya? The exact same thing. We funded death squads to overthrow Gaddafi. What happened in Gaza? Well, we've supported Israel for over 100 years. Yeah, over 100 years, because it's 1948 is not when the Zionist program started. You got to go look at that. So that's the quality of the mainstream press. I'm not going to spend any time debunking that stupid article. So again, I'd like to remind everybody that we have a political candidate in Nebraska who needs your help right now. We've got Dan Burdorf, who's running on the Tax Wall Street Party in Nebraska. He is running for U.S. Senate against David Domina, the Democrat, and Ben Sass, the guy who has just an alarming number of pedophile scandals that follows him around, but none of it ever sticks. So check out Dan Burdorf, that's Burdorfe. He's in Nebraska, Tax Wall Street Party. He's pro-gun, pro-life, and he is pro-taxing Wall Street at 1%, pro-nationalizing the Fed, pro-parity agriculture, and pro-infrastructure programs. So please, it's danfornebraska.com. Check out his website, also the taxwallstreetparty.org. And remember, if you're in the South Carolina, North Carolina area, go check out on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. at Health First in Florence, South Carolina on Palmetto Street. They have these viewings of documentaries and meetings and discussions about chemtrails, vaccines, that sort of thing. And lastly, please remember to keep listening to Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at UCY.TV. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
This is